Greetings and felicitations, dear audience. I am in McCombs. Since I've gone over my first 3 books that I've written in videos 1, 2, and 3, I'm going to go over what I learned in my first year. This is going to be a more in-depth video than before. You can tell because I've rolled up my sleeves and I'm sitting at a desk. So we're going to talk about craft, and we're going to talk about craft in detail. So let's get working. Salutations and admirations, dear friends. Let's talk about the top 10 things I've learned my first year of writing. At the end, I'm going to have 10 writing exercises as well. I'm going to skip a lot of the preamble and let's just get to work. Number 1 is more personal and less writing craft. Do you know the environment where you work best? For me, my writing efficiency and clarity is best done at a cafe or copy shop. Amusingly enough, I don't actually drink coffee and I'm not a big fan of tea. The ladies at the local Starbucks will tell you that I'm a big fan of hot chocolate with sprinkles. And if it's a little bit warm, then I'll take one of their fruity waterish drinks, refreshers I think they're called. Having my headphones on is very important for me. I need a little bit of silence, but not too much silence. And if I'm working at home, I really don't do well as far as writing. That's because work is where I work, at the gym is where I work, and at the cafe is where I work at my second job. So if I go home, I won't have as many micro distractions, and I don't have a person who's laughing over there or a person walking to the bathroom over there. So I tend to get unfocused and distracted permanently, and then I'm done for the night. I have a bit of an ADHD brain, so you might understand what I mean if you have that as well. A tiny distraction gives my brain just enough break where I can keep my focus for extended periods of time. If I'm somewhere without any distractions, then I tend to overload trying to keep my focus, and then I lose it altogether. So for me, the place is a cafe, but you have to figure out what works for you, and also what time of the day, and also have you completed your other tasks. So you hear the stories about writers who will clean their house top to bottom, have everything put away before they can even write because they're procrastinating. So again, that's why working at a cafe is better for me, so I don't wash the dishes, vacuum, do all the laundry, that sort of thing. I have to be fed, I have to know that most of my chores are done, and then I'm listening to music, I'm focusing on the task, and I have some micro distractions that can distract me for a few moments, and then I'm back on task. So ask yourself these questions. Where are you best focused for writing? Try different locations out. With the library, is it quiet? Is it too quiet? Or is it not quiet enough? At home with cats and music on the radio, does that work for you? At a coffee shop or cafe, maybe a whole different environment works for you. Maybe it's a silent closet, who knows? Experiment and find out what works best for you. If you log your hours and figure out where you're productive, and being productive means what you define productive as, not somebody else, not me, not anybody but you, you can find out where you're productive and where the best writing environment for you is. I would say to try it again and again, so that way you find out what works and it's not just a random fluke. But what I always like to say, it is what works for you, not what you want to work for you, but what actually works for you. Now, during this coronavirus time, I'm thankful I didn't start a new writing project. Right now, I'm doing a lot of deep edits and these videos, so I can be more flexible with my script writing and editing because I don't have it locked into a certain habituation where I'm most productive. So again, find somewhere that's productive for you, or find a way to make the space that you have to be in, like right now, productive for yourself. What kind of writer works for you? There's an amazing video by Ellen Brock, novel editor, who did about the types of writers. I'm going to put a title card up here to watch her video. Instead of going over all her information, I'll ask you to go watch her video, then come back here and we'll talk about it. I'll wait. Done? Didn't watch it? Going to watch it after this? That's fine. Really good video, 2 thumbs up. Figure out what kind of writer works for you, not what you want as some sort of romantic ideal. The mirage of my romantic ideal of being a writer was sitting in a cafe with a little chapeau, puffing on a clove cigarette with a jacket with elbows patched in. One, that's not me and was never me and never will be me. 2, that is a super old stereotype from decades ago that really doesn't apply to who I am and never really did. 3, I'm not a discovery writer, but the romantic ideal of me being one was really ruinous to my writing. If you watch Ellen Brock, novel editor's video, then you know there's a difference in depth between plotter versus pantser, outliner versus discovery writer. What works for you? Here's a way you can figure that out. Write a chapter completely blind. Did that work? If not, then you might not be a pantser. If you imagined your chapter and wrote it without an outline, did it go well? Yes, then you might be an imagination pantser. Did you write an outline and you quit halfway through? Then you might not be a planner or outliner. Did you write a bare bone plot, then imagine the rest, and when you wrote it, it went well? Congratulations, you found out what works, and that's all that matters. Like an archery video that I really love, writing is about what works. So you might be somewhere in the middle, on one end, the other, or somewhere in between. So don't define yourself by what others say you are, but find out for yourself. Again, to reference Ellen Brock's video, what works for you are, do you like intuitive structure or methodological structure? Go watch her video and you'll understand what I mean. When I started, I wanted to be an intuitive writer. I thought not only would I just write by the seat of my pants, I would know exactly how to structure my books just by my gut. I've written a ton of books, right? So I should know how to do this, or I've read a ton of books, so I should know it even better. Wrong, 100% wrong in my case. I have a touch of ADHD and a touch of dyslexia, thus I don't read the same way that most people. I don't comprehend the same way people do. If I read a page of the book, I might skip several lines, I might go back, I might skip a whole paragraph and then start over. There might be 2 sentences I completely skipped and I didn't even realize it until I reread something later. When I read a book, sometimes it's one whole meaning, and then if I reread a book, it might be a completely different meaning than the previous time. An example of that is I reread Roger Zelazny's 9 Princes of Amber, and I realized something that I had missed in, say, my first 10 readings. Spoiler alert, Corwin is telling the whole story to his son Merlin. I had read around that line apparently and never made the connection before, or I skipped it over it, or I didn't look at it the same way. So that is one way that I found something new about a book that I had read many times before. So therefore, I am not an intuitive writer. I have to use methodological structure. I make connections by writing it down and knowing what those connections are ahead of time, rather than just having that structure in my brain and I know it by the books that I've read already. I have to structure my novels, which isn't necessarily the same as outlining a chapter or the book itself. I outline an introduction, an inciting incident. I'm defining what kind of story it is. Does it have a linear story, or is it a circular story? Does it have what I like to call the train collision parallel story? viewpoint, or does it have parallel viewpoints? Are there rotating viewpoints? I need to know those things about my book rather than just knowing and going on with it. Some people who read know that intuitively and can just do it by their gut as they go. However, I don't. I've read books and gotten to the end where if you asked me right after I finished it, go ahead and write out the how the book works, I wouldn't be able to do it. But if I sat down as I read through the book and did a methodological study of that book, I might be able to do it. So one of the first things I can tell you is know what works for you, and unfortunately a lot of times that comes down to actually doing it. Like I said, I made a mistake in my first 3 books by not knowing that, thinking I was intuitive when I'm definitely more a methodological type of author. And I never did get to know that until I got to book 4. Now, book 4 is not necessarily that much better than book 1, 2, or 3, but at least it tended to be much more structured and have more plot, conflict, and purpose. But if I don't follow those types of structure, then I tend to end up with incomprehensible gibberish. Number 4, let's talk about structure. I like nuts and bolts more than generalities. So book structure, viewpoint structure can be 1 or 2 things depending on what you're writing and how you're writing. Sounds a little dumb, so let me explain on that. Book structure can be about how many acts it has. If you've watched a video or read books about movies, plays, those sorts of things, you'll know what I'm talking about. Most movies generally tend towards a 3-act structure, whereas plays a lot of times will use Shakespearean or 5-act structure. 3-act structure is you have an introduction, essentially the conflict and resolution, and there are specific plot points in there. If you've ever read Save the Cat Writes a Book, that's a very good introduction to advanced structure on a 3-act structure. For 5-act structure, this is a lot of what you learn in high school or even college. It's got the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and then denouement. That generally is known as classical or Shakespearean structure. There's also what I like to call viewpoint structure, which is important. Do you have one viewpoint through your entire story? Do you have rotating viewpoints? Are there parallel viewpoints that come to a meeting at some point in before, during, after the climax? And that can be done in any different ways. And you can also have the story structure be, say, 3 or 5-act structure with different type of viewpoint structure as well. If you have 2 stories that intermingle with each other and lead to a certain structure, you have to have that structure of the viewpoint work with the structure of your story structure. Otherwise, if they're at odds, then it doesn't work out very well. That's one of the reasons why I like what I call the train crash parallel viewpoint structure, where you have essentially 2 plots that are going in tandem until the climax, where both viewpoint characters or people come together, and then the climax actually occurs there. I think it's very interesting to raise a lot of dread that you see the train crash happening and you see it coming a mile away, and that keeps you reading. Structure can also be narrative chapter structure. So you have how the story itself is arranged and how that goes through. Everybody's heard of the hero journey. You've watched little hobbitses steal a family heirloom from a broken old man, and then they destroy his entire nation. You've seen that, you know that story, so you know what I mean by the hero's journey. A person has a starting point in a calm, safe world that is broken. They go on a journey, learn a bunch of different stuff, have a bunch of plot points, and then they defeat the big bad and go home. And so that's a circular plot structure. You can have a 3 or 5 act story structure with a rotating viewpoint character structure, and then the story structure where you have certain things arranged in a hero's journey as a circular structure as well. So you can have definite multiple ways of having structure in just one story. A linear story structure would be one where the book starts in one place and the character has an initial state. They go through 3 or 5 acts of a story structure, let's say, and then they have their climax and they go to the end of the story where they don't go back home, but the new place where they're at is possibly their new home where they lived. The old home doesn't mean anything to them, or it's lost. When I do a video just on structure, I'll go into a lot of what that means, how to arrange that, how to actually define those things for your story, so you'll know how there are a ton of different ways you can actually structure your story in any number of different ways. Viewpoint characters are important. Whose story is it and why? Not every story needs to be about the hero. In fact, the current book I'm editing has the viewpoint of the villain who thinks he's the hero, but the main character who does most of the growth is one of the other characters that seems secondary, and the other character who is really the hero of the story doesn't make that much change and is therefore kind of boring. And so having the viewpoint of the villain is much more interesting and it works a lot better. It's very ambitious, and it was a complete accident how that actually worked. The train crash viewpoint structure I'm using in this book has another train with the viewpoint of a passive viewer of a group of characters as they careen headlong into another train. He's watching the crash happen in slow motion and builds a lot of dread that way. So ask yourself, whose story is this? Is it an interesting person? In my current project, like I said, the good person isn't interesting. She's wonderful, but she's a bit boring. The evil guy is much more interesting. So it's his story essentially about her. In book 3, if you've seen that video, my viewpoint character was redundant. It should have been the protagonist, who is also the main character, is also the viewpoint character, and that's very common in most books. So you can use all those together, you can split it up or do it in different ways, so you have different ways of having a viewpoint. So we're going to talk about a little bit more viewpoint here in a second. If you don't know, first person perspective is using I as though the person is telling the story to you or another person. Thus it reads, I went to the store, but they were out of toilet paper and my butt was itchy. Third person is using he, her, they, or other pronouns. Yes, I'm a huge proponent of alternative pronouns, not only because they're kind and inclusive, but also because aliens and AI in the future might not like our pronouns in our limited language. Thus, third person reads, he went to raid his neighbor for toilet paper, but all he found was a death cult and his butt remained itchy. Forget saying a person because I'm not going to go in that, and that's for English teachers and literature folks. I love you English teachers, but yeah, I'll never forget or forgive some of those terrible books I had to read. Figure out the voice of the character early so you can establish the viewpoint and whose story you're writing. Then you can decide how you're writing and establish the voice of your character. You might ask, what is voice? So I'm glad you asked, and we're going to get into that next. Character voice is all about how the viewpoint character reads. In first person, you'll read all the thoughts and ideas from the viewpoint person. In third person viewpoint, you might read some of their thoughts, but all of their actions, and more importantly, their reactions to things that happened around them, either people or the environment. For first person, is this person sarcastic, sardonic, enthusiastic, apathetic, naive? Show that through how they think about things. Show that through their actions and reactions. This wonderful part about first person that I love is you can really bring a person to life. With third person, you still have some of their thoughts, their actions and reactions, but you can also show some of the actions and reactions of other people other than the viewpoint character, so that way you end up with a lot of character building in between characters as well. Make the viewpoint characters breathe. That's really important. So that way, when someone's reading a book, they make it an emotional connection to that person. If you're reading the story through the eyes of a young mother who lost their whole family in diseased wasteland, then you can see the sense of longing for a normal family life. Show her talking about it, thinking about it, acting on it. That's very important. The point of voice is to connect the reader to the character so they care and want to continue reading the book and the ups and downs they really are invested in. This isn't just by plot or by actions or the setting, it's an emotional connection between the reader and the character. With voice, this includes things like dialogue and also how they view the setting. If your first person viewpoint character talks a certain way that is very distinct, then it will speak to your character. If the first person viewpoint character thinks a certain way and talks a certain way, is there a reason for that? Are they trying to live through a post-apocalyptic diseased nightmare world and hate everybody, but they say they love and cherish everyone? If so, then that says a whole lot about your character. For third person, their inner thoughts shouldn't be just snippets of here and there and not much real meaning, but it should be serious bombs of characterization. Each real thought means a whole lot. How they match, how they talk and act should also have some meaning. Third person is like a camera looking at the person. It can be either close or very far away. If it's close, you're in more of their head, not anybody else. If you're far away, then you can see and hear everybody else, as well as the main viewpoint character, if there is one, because you don't necessarily have to have one in third person. Your characters should look at the world in a way that reflects what they fear, what they want, and what they need. It shows who they are. If they see a beautiful castle and they think it looks fake and stupid, why is that? If they see the exact same castle and it looks like a magical fairy tale kingdom come true, why is that? You are showing what your characters are by showing their reactions, how they talk, how they think, and how they act and react to the world around them. Number 7, dialogue has to be interesting. A literature book might get away with dialogue that goes nowhere and does nothing for the story. I deal with speculative fiction, so I'll discuss what I know. Dialogue can show your character who they are and how they interact with the world. It can also show how they think and interact with other characters. Do they like children? They might talk to a child in a very nice way. They hate children, they might be nasty to a child, or if they're in polite company, they might ignore the child. If your dialogue is full of nothing, then you're missing out on characterization, conflict, you're not furthering the plot, you're missing out on a lot of theme and subtext in your story. Make dialogue mean something. Not every line needs to be world-shaking, not everything said needs to be hilarious or ominous, but most of it should. You can do amazing things by just repeating lines from the beginning of a book to the end of the book in different contexts. For instance, when Captain America meets Falcon for the first time and says, "on your left," while they're running, it means something completely different than and has a substantial payoff in Endgame when Falcon says it to Captain America. Don't be afraid to add things with dialogue to make it more interesting. Dialogue tags. Don't overdo it. Find your happy medium that works for you. You see people in real life, how they talk and how they move. Look at their nonverbal aspects of communication. Thus, I love to put a tag of "he said looking away" or "she blushed and then said." You can also add tension to a scene by using your dialogue. Are two characters having a terrible time with a conflict with each other, then they don't necessarily talk to each other in one says one thing and then they respond to the other. Instead, one character talks past the other character and the other character only says what they want to say to make their point, like in a real-world argument. Dialogue can be used for exploring your world with rumors and stories and other snippets of the world to explain a lot in world building. Not info dumps of pages and paragraphs of that, but just a snippet here and there can really make your world come alive. Now here's a personal opinion. I would suggest not trying to use vernacular in broken English. In other words, you take out a bunch of letters and put a bunch of dashes or quotation marks or any number of different things like that to make it sound regional or ethnic or anything like that. A lot of people in those communities will find it offensive. I know when I hear a lot of people trying to do that with Southern accents, I find it pretty ridiculous. I roll my eyes and it takes me completely out of the story. Number 8, plot and conflict are both verbs. That sounds a little silly, and this is the first time you've heard this. It does sound a little odd. Let me explain. You have to have people plot and conflict over things. A character should plot about what they want, how they're going to win it. They should conflict with another person about what they want to get to what they need. If you have a plot and it doesn't really happen, then you just wrote essentially a guidebook of your world and the major characters there. If you have conflict and it's really that serious, then you need to flesh it out and actually have it occur. If not, why do you have a 100-page book? Why not just put a short story where there's somebody says no, somebody says I want this, they go okay, and then you're done. So make the conflict punch the character in the face at certain times. It needs to be, in some ways, if you've seen the Rocky movies, where Rocky goes the distance, he keeps at it, and eventually by determination, perseverance, and ingenuity, he actually wins. However, he goes through heck to get there. Maybe not just physically your characters need to suffer, but emotionally or spiritually or in other ways. Have your antagonist actually plot and conflict against your protagonist. The antagonist needs to antagonize. If you keep everything just for the climax, then the middle is going to sag and really suffer and be boring, and therefore people might not get to your amazing climax. I know all about that. That's exactly how essentially I wrote my first 3 books, so please don't be like me. Now, not every book needs to be about saving the world. Not every story needs to save humanity from certain doom. Even if it's just saving the ice cream shop from being bulldozed, and the hero has to challenge the evil businessman's son to a snowboarding race, there has to be some sort of stakes in the whole situation. There needs to be a conflict and a bad thing that happens if it doesn't work out, and a good thing or a status quo that happens if the hero wins. The conflict needs to mean something to your hero. It doesn't necessarily need to be a loss of life, and it can be something similar, a loss of innocence or a loss of a sense of a place to belong, happy life disrupted. At the end of the video, I'm going to put 10 writing exercises, and if you're flinching from conflict, if you're not putting it in, this one will be hard, but it can be very worth it. I flinched every book I ever wrote for the conflict. I didn't really want to make my characters suffer, and so book 1, book 2, book 3, and book 4, yes, I've written 5 books at least, we'll get there, but those books I didn't really put a conflict in because I felt bad about it. So all my books have a saggy middle, and I didn't put the conflict in there to make it tense, to make it move. I've learned better, but I'm still working hard to do better because it's hard for me to do that. Have your dialogue be about how worried they are about the conflict. Have the dialogue be about plotting with the conflict. Have complications upon complications happen to the hero, but don't go overboard. It becomes too much. It becomes unbelievable. But even a victory should come with some sort of cost. Conflict needs to happen, otherwise your story doesn't move. Number 9, don't make a cast of thousands all be forgettable characters. Have a few really standout and important characters. You can have a bunch of interesting side characters or even minor characters, but your main characters should really mean something. If you have 3 really smart characters, why not pare that down to just 1? If you have 2 really strong characters in some regard and they're not conflicting each other, then why not just make that 1 character? Not every character needs to have a love interest, so therefore there's a character you could possibly get rid of. Have the story be about amazing people. Focus on a few amazing characters. If you dilute your story with a cast of 20, 30, 40, then you may lose some of those people that don't stand out. Do you have everybody have a line of dialogue when a big argument happens? If you do, then some of your characters might just be repeats of other characters, and thus nobody really pays attention to them or they get confused. Focus on 1 or 2 characters. You don't have to kill them per se, but you do need to pare them down so they really become important. You can do like I do and put them in a sequel or put them in a prequel or write a short story about them that shows that scene so you can really see who that person is if it's really inside of you. Your characters should be different enough where the reader really loves each and every one of your characters for their own reasons. It's like a boy band. Everybody has their type and everybody wants to read about that type. How do you make characters stand out and keep a cast of thousands from taking out your book like a virus stealing all the paper? You can either plan it out, you can imagine it out, or you can edit it out. For planners, this can be easy. You really like or love 1 character, so you keep them, you get rid of some of the others. You have a funny character, you plan out their plot, you're good. And then you add a love interest, and then another one, and then another one. You see where I'm getting at. You have to have discipline. You have to make tough decisions on who is important, why they're important, and what's important to your story. Take all the funny lines from the jester character and give them to the one that you like more. Take all the heroic lines from a secondary character and give them to the hero. Yes, this is painful. You have to focus your story, and instead of a diffuse light, you have a laser. As well, you can always write that character into their own book. I did that with book 2. I created a wonderful character that I loved dearly, and that's where book 3 came from. If you saw my video on book 3, you've heard that. I loved that character, so I gave her her own book. Sadly, it was a pretty terrible and awful book. Number 10, make an amazing world, which can mean any number of different things. Your world can be built however you want. One method is to take 1 or 2 things. If you change it, could completely change the world. You need to think, though, through the logical problems with each change you make. Don't just go for the obvious changes either. If people live on an ice world in science fiction, do they have a set of seasons in the habitation dome? Do they set up gardens to remind them of warmth and of their home? Do they have 100 different words for snow and ice? Do they have a better constitution to survive in the cold where heat is a luxury that very few can afford? Do they see in infrared when outdoors or at night? For fantasy, if an evil lord lived 2,000 years ago and the elves supported him, yeah, not the orcs this time, do people hate elves? Are elves hiding in their forests away from everybody else? Do elves hate themselves? If any elf shows any interest in evil magics, do they automatically kill that person? Do dwarves hate the elves even more and now they start wars constantly with them? Are elves banishing their best and brightest just in case? What does it really mean for your story? Change a few statistics on a character sheet, but also change how the characters interact with each other and with the world. Is there a heroic ideal of a single elf and a single dwarf who overthrew the Lord? If so, then make that reflect in the story. Don't be afraid to make the story strange, but also make it familiar. You can have the fantasy world have an elf registration. You can have where the elves have to show papers all the time and are stopped and searched by the guards, thus the elves became a symbol of racism. Let me add though, don't ignore actual racism if there are people or elves of color in your book. Show systematic oppression like how elves can't get a job in a good area or a job. Does that apply to humans of color as well? Does that apply to other races? You have to make the world breathe and not just skim on the very type. It's okay to do a lot of research if you want to put this type of theme into your book. Do a lot of research to know what you're talking about and develop it at a really deep level. In science fiction, does everyone have to go register their ship and have an inspection? If so, then your hero may have to go to the space DMV. Does your hero have to take a flying test? Then show how nervous they are when they're trying to get their driver's license like in real life. It's different but similar. People really like to read about themselves in a world different from their own, experiencing similar or the same problems and overcoming them and thriving. Thank you for listening and watching this video. Now that I've done the quick deep dive into the top 10 things I learned my first year of writing, let's get into some writing exercises. Number 1, figure out what your happy place is. After you take some time to figure out what place and music or whatever your environment it is, where are you the most productive? Figure that out. Maybe write it down. Now, define your productivity the best way you need to define it. Don't define it how somebody else might define it. Write in a park, write on a lake, write with a pen or the blood of your enemies. Number 2, plan out a chapter or short story. Write it. Did it feel good? Did it feel right for you? Write something you have imagined but never planned. Write a chapter or a short story that is just in your head. Did it feel good? Which one worked better for you? What produced the best results? It's hard, but be honest with yourself about how productive you are and what the best results were for how you did it. Number 3, write out the structure of your favorite book. Define what kind of narrative, viewpoint, or story structure is in there. Was that easy? Then you may be an intuitive writer. Was it hard or impossible? Then you may be a methodological writer. So which way feels better to you if you plan out structure for your book, or if you just go by the seat of your pants with the structure, but maybe you outlined what actually happened in the book and who your characters are. Number 4, go to the internet and find structure for books. Find viewpoint structure, narrative structure, story structure. Write out your book with a 3-act structure, now a 5-act story structure. Does your viewpoint shift? If so, is it rotating between characters who are all in the same group? Is it different groups and therefore it's a parallel viewpoint structure? Does the story go through a linear story and then end, or do they go from the beginning through the story and then end up back in the same place with increased knowledge, power, and understanding about the world and themselves? Imagine your story and figure that out from those same types of structures, which one works best for your stories. Number 5, who is your viewpoint character? Why are they the viewpoint character? Do they speak as I to the reader? Does the reader read a pronoun? If you've changed the viewpoint, would it change a chapter or a story you just wrote? Write a paragraph in a different viewpoint. Do you like it? Does it work? Does it not work? Is the original even better? Try a secondary character, speaking in the first person, telling the story about your main character, and that main character and story is in the third person. Or write about a secondary character in the third person who's in the story, but you wrote that story in the first person viewpoint of the main character. Do you look at the story in a different way? Do you look at the main characters or the secondary character in a different way? Because that can really help figure out whose story this is. Number 6, how does your main character think? How do they talk? Do they act in a certain way? Take a chapter, actually write it out. Go somewhere private or post-virus and go to the middle of a park and act out your character. What did you learn about them? What does that say about the voice of your character? Speaking of acting like your character, number 7, why not get a loved one to help you speak the lines in a scene? You be the protagonist and they are the antagonist. Switch it up. Did the dialogue seem natural? Did it seem fake? Is the character different than you thought? Have the main character describe a feature of your world. Have them introduce another character to you at a party they might be at. Number 8, what is your character plotting? What do they want and how are they going to get it? What do they need and what things are they going to do and have happen to them to figure out what they actually really need? Here's the hard part. Write a short story about your story and take everyone and kill them except for the hero and the antagonist. Everyone but them dies. At the end, the hero realizes that they got what they wanted but lost everything that they needed. This exercise is to allow yourself and give yourself permission to destroy everybody and everything in your story. Sit with it. It's okay to make your character suffer. Don't flinch. Don't make it easy. Don't make it simple. Make it worse, make it awful, make it terrible, so that way you can really make the conflict explode and come alive in your books. Number 9, list your main characters. List all your secondary characters. List all your side characters. Write out who they are and what kind of people they are. Take every second character name, 1, 2, 3, 4. So take number 2, delete their name, and take all those characteristics and put them on character 1. And keep doing that for all the main and secondary and side characters. What you're doing is you're taking everything and concentrating it into one half of your characters. You're essentially snapping and halving your characters, so that way you give the survivors the best qualities of everybody who's been lost. Not the goodest qualities, but the most interesting qualities. Number 10, go to image search. Type in your setting. Find 5 pictures that relate to your setting. Write a quick scene on your characters going to that place. Click on just a random image. Does that fit into your world? Why does it? Why doesn't it? And then have your character go to that place and describe it anyway. Thank you for watching and listening to this video. I hope you learned something. May your creative endeavors bring you peace, love, and happiness.